I'm Richard Roden. I'm a professor here in the Department of Pathology at Johns Hopkins, and I have the honor of hosting Aimee Kramer. This presentation is being sponsored by the Sidney Kimmel Comprehensive Cancer Center and also the Maryland Cigarette Restitution Fund, and is part of our Lunch Learn Link series of lectures. Aimee is a graduate of Johns Hopkins. She received her PhD here. She began in 2003, and then when she left, she went to IARC as a fellow, and then finally moved on to the National Cancer Institute as a cancer prevention fellow. And she has since stayed there and has risen to the to become a tenured, I understand, congratulations, senior investigator at the National Cancer Institute. So it's a great honor to have you back, Aimee, and look forward to your talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am quite pleased to be here. It's always nice to come back to where you were trained and kind of talk about what you've learned and what you've been doing since that time. So today I'm going to talk about HPV-associated cancers. In fact, my whole research portfolio focuses on HPV. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So today I'm going to first talk about the epidemiology of HPV-driven cancers, and then I'll go on to talk about prevention of these cancers. And the reason I like studying HPV cancers so much is because I think we have the tools now to prevent them. So I view these cancers as fully preventable at this point, and yet we still have a huge global burden. So I'm going to talk about prophylactic HPV vaccination, so primary prevention, and then I'll move on to talk about secondary prevention through early detection and screening. The first thing that people would normally think about is, oh, she's going to talk about cervical cancer. It's kind of the hallmark of a successful screening program in the world. I am not going to focus on that. That is not what my research focuses on. Other people in my division do that work. But instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about some prevention opportunities for oropharyngeal cancer, which is one of the cancers caused by HPV. So just as a reminder, there are several infectious agents that cause cancers the world around. I'm showing you here that these include cancers of the cervix, anogenital region, oropharynx, and some very small numbers of oral cavity cancers. These are caused by human papillomavirus. And in fact, of the 14 million new cancer cases that occur each year, about 2.2 million are attributable to infectious agents, and HPV infection accounts for 30% of these infection-caused cancers. So again, we have tools to prevent these cancers, and yet HPV is the second most common cause of infection-driven cancer. I don't like that. Let's talk a little bit about human papillomavirus. As you know, it's a double-stranded DNA virus. At this point, there has been, I think, more than 300 described HPV types, but only 15 of these are associated with cancer. And HPV 16 and 18 are the most important HPV genotypes. So when we say there's 15 types that cause cancer, these are not evenly distributed in terms of their risk for cancer. HPV 16 and 18 cause about 70% of the cancers at the cervix. So when we think about the attributable fraction, when we go down the anatomic sites, the mouse. So in this slide, I'm showing the cancer sites. So again, HPV causes cancer at 6 different sites: the cervix, the anus, the penis, the vagina, vulva, oropharynx, and then some oral cavity and larynx cancers. When we take a world view and we look at the attributable fraction, so the proportion of the cancers due to HPV, we know that HPV is a necessary cause of cervical cancer. So here we see 100%. The story is pretty similar for anal cancers, where we see almost 90% are due to HPV. But then we start to really get into some etiologic heterogeneity at these other anatomic sites, where HPV causes a portion of them, but not all of them. And what really jumps out is that when you go into oropharynx cancer, which is actually where I started my work, which is what I was doing when I was here, you not only see etiologic heterogeneity, you see it by geographic region, which I think is super interesting, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what is the annual burden of HPV-associated cancers? And here I'm breaking it down by gender. So again, listing the anatomic sites where HPV causes some of the cancers, the number of cases per year. These are data that IARC generates in their GloboCan program. So they go around the world putting out cancer registries that are of high enough quality to really capture these type of data. They then superimpose on this the number that are attributable to HPV infection, given the etiologic heterogeneity, and then they lay down the numbers by gender. And so, of course, when we have 530,000 cases of cervical cancer and we say it's 100% due to HPV, you can see they all line up here. And I'm just going to bring your attention to the bottom, which you probably can't even see out there. But when we take a global view of HPV-driven cancers, we really need to stay focused on the females. The females are having more than 500,000 new cases per year, and that we see about an order of magnitude fewer in the men. This story is going to flip around a little, though, when we start to look at other geographic regions. In this slide, it's really set up the same way, except it's breaking it down by age. So under 50, 50 to 69 and 70, when we come down to the bottom, again, what we see is it's not following the pattern that we see for most cancers. For a prostate, for some breast, where we see these median ages, 55, 60, 70. This is a cancer that affects younger individuals, and this is another reason why I think prevention is so important, because it really affects the quality of life for decades after a diagnosis, if the cancer has survived. So we see really an even breakdown between those under 50 and those over 50 to 69 years. So this is these cancers occur in younger individuals. And finally, as I said, we're going to look at it by world region. So this is stratified by cervix in blue, and you can immediately see cervical cancer dominates. Anogenital cancers in gray, excluding cervix, and then head and neck cancers. And this is just burden by number of cases and the proportion of the total by world region. Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern America, Eastern Asia, North Africa and Western Asia. I don't know if you can see the bottom. And then North America here. So what immediately jumps out at us is that when we're looking at numbers, we see, low middle income countries really having a lot of these cancers. And then when we look at the relative proportion of the cancers, this is what actually jumps out at me. So when we're focused on world regions, we're thinking cervical cancer in women. How do we prevent this? When we turn our attention to North America, the story looks a little different. What we're seeing is that there's the same number of cervical cancers as there are non-cervical cancers. And so as we move into discuss vaccination, we'll discuss that the needs are really a little bit different by country. And then finally, when we stratify this by the development index, so low human development index, medium, this is really just tied to at an individual level within a country, how wealthy or lack of resources they are. And again, looking at cervix in blue, anogenital in green, and then head and neck, what we see is that in these low and medium human development index countries, we see the burden of cervical cancers. And then when we turn our attention to the high and very high, we see these other cancers becoming more relevant. I'm going to keep going just in the interest of time. So my summary of the epidemiology is that in the absence of screening, which is proxied by these low and middle human development indices countries, cervical cancer absolutely dominates HPV-related cancer risk. However, what we saw is that in the developed settings, such as the United States, the proportion of the HPV-related cancers is really represented by non-cervix and by males being higher. I didn't show you, I skipped past that slide, but HPV 16 and 18 account for 80% of the HPV-related cancer burden worldwide, which is important when we start to think about vaccination. And we also saw the slide that showed important variations in the attributable fraction for HPV in the head and neck cancers, and that was by world region and also by calendar period, although I didn't show that. So now let's move on to talk about primary prevention through vaccination. So I want to just take a step back and remind everyone that the goals of HPV vaccination is to directly reduce the risk of infection and disease in the vaccinees, but it's also to indirectly reduce the risk by reducing the general population prevalence of HPV vaccine types, and that's obviously herd immunity. So a decade ago, the first HPV vaccine was licensed in this country. It was the quadrivalent vaccine referred to as Gardasil, made by Merck. It covered HPV 16 and 11, which we said are the most important HPV types as they account for 80% of the HPV-driven cancers. It's adjuvanted with a simple aluminum salt adjuvant. And when Merck started doing their research programs, and the GlaxoSmithKline as well, there's strong immunologic dogma that says for this type of vaccine, this is a subunit vaccine, it takes the L1, the VLP, the virus-like particle of HPV, multiple doses are required. You need a prime, a second prime, and a boost. And so these pharmaceutical companies started their research programs off 3-dose investigations. And so when they were initially licensed, they came out as 3-dose programs. What we've come to understand, and I'll show some of the data, is that 2 doses in adolescents actually gives similar antibody levels and levels of protection as the 3 doses. And so that's why this just happened last month. In this country, our recommendation dropped from 3 doses down to 2 for adolescents. So for people under the age of 15, it's a 2-dose schedule, and for those 15 and older, it stays a 3-dose schedule. And just to follow up, so the quadrivalent vaccine by Gardasil came out a decade ago. 9 years ago, the bivalent vaccine came online. It only protects against HPV 16, whereas this one covers 6 and 11. These are the types responsible for genital warts. And because it came late to the game, and because it probably doesn't cover genital warts, and because its research program only focused on females and not males, it kind of became a second-class citizen in this country and is actually being pulled off the market as we speak in the United States. This is not the global story, but it is the story for the United States. So what is the goal of HPV vaccination? Because when we think of vaccines, we immediately think we want sterilizing immunity, it needs to be lifelong. That is not the case for HPV. HPV is our most common sexually transmitted infection, so we really want to have onboard antibodies and protection during the duration of someone's peak sexual activity. So this being the most common STD that we have, shortly after sexual debut, and I'm showing age on the x-axis, people acquire, and I'm going to talk about cervix first, cervical HPV infection. So shortly after sexual debut, I think the median in this country is around 15 years, people acquire HPV infection. Most people clear it. They don't even know the difference. It's not a big deal. For those that don't clear it, this is followed by a precancer, which we call HSIL, which will go on in the absence of screening to cancer. So when we think about these HPV vaccine goals, all of the recommendations have focused on wiping out the screen line. So what do we need to do? We need to get vaccination on board prior to sexual debut. So right now our vaccinations recommendations say at a late age 11 to 12, that's when we want to get HPV vaccine on board. And that'll prevent the green line, and since HPV is a necessary cause of cervical cancer, if you wipe out the green line, you wipe out the blue line, you wipe out the red line, and we've solved the problem. One of the interesting things is that when we look at oral HPV infection, the pattern is not the same. What we've seen in oral HPV infection is, first of all, it is much less prevalent, about an order of magnitude less, and it actually kind of stays constant across the age span. A lot of the high-quality work on oral HPV is coming out of the Epi department here by Amber D'Souza. I follow her work very closely. So one of the interesting things to note is I told you that we just need to wipe out this green line. So when we think about the duration of vaccination, if we're vaccinating 11 to 12-year-olds, I would like, 10 to 15 years of vaccine protection, and I think we're good to go. I don't know if that's going to protect against everything that happens later in life. I think that's an open question. But since we also, right now we see that the vaccine protection is lasting for quite some time, maybe it'll work. I'm just going to throw up some quick data to kind of support everything I've said so far on HPV vaccines. These are some of the pivotal trials that led to licensure of the HPV vaccines, both the Merck trials as well as the Cervarix trials by GSK. Basically, in summary, after studying tens of thousands of women around the world, what they've seen is that if a woman is naive to HPV infection, these vaccines prevent in nearly 100% of all infections and disease. It's astounding. So those were 3-dose data. The way we got down to then 2 doses was through non-inferiority trials. So what was shown is that people were, they took the 3-dose women and then looked at 2-dose adolescents, and they compared antibody titers. And since usually younger people make stronger, more robust antibodies, these antibody titers were non-inferior to that of 3 doses. And I'm not going to walk through this slide because I realize you probably can't see it. But that is how we bridged down then to 2 doses. What about this vaccine protecting at non-cervical sites? Everything I've told you so far was at the cervix. So the NCI initiated a vaccine trial in 2004, so prior to licensure. And in that trial, we initially were focused on looking at HPV vaccination against the cervical infections, but then we expanded and included protection against oral infections, anal infections, and vulvar infections. And this is some of my work, and I'll talk a little bit more about my work in a minute. But I wanted to just tell you that in addition to protecting against cervix, what we observed is that there's high vaccine efficacy against oral HPV 16 and 18 infections, as well as anal HPV 16 and 18 infections. And these data have actually been supported by other studies as well. So now we have this vaccine that has very robust data showing it protects against cervical HPV infection and disease. And we have more data accumulating showing that it also protects against anal, oral, vulvar, vaginal. It protects against infections and diseases at all these sites. So are we good? It's a win? So unfortunately, here's the story in the United States. So adolescent vaccines were relatively uncommon until about a decade ago. Usually our vaccines are administered in childhood. In 2005, there was U.S. vaccination for Tdap and meninge. And what happens when we roll out a vaccine in the United States is we roll it out and then we start collecting data. And this is data from the National Health Interview Survey, I believe, which collects vaccination rates. So we put a vaccine out. A year later, we start collecting data, and we look at the percent vaccinated within a couple years of being available on the market. We're seeing rates around 80 or 90%. That's what happened with Tdap, and it's what happened with meninge. So a year later, the HPV vaccine was approved and recommended, and we started collecting data, and what happened? And so in the blue, what we're looking at is 1 dose in the blue dotted line for girls. And what we see is it started to go up, and then it flattened out. And our current vaccination rates hover around 60%. The male recommendation came out about 3 years later, and what they show is it kind of followed the same thing, although boys are actually still on a slope looking promising, but suffice it to say, we don't have this uptake that we'd really like to see for vaccines in the United States. Nonetheless, we're still seeing tremendous drops in HPV infection in the United States. This slide is looking at HPV prevalence prior to vaccine implementation and then post-vaccine implementation. And I'm calling your attention in the red to the 4 types in the quadrivalent vaccine. And if we look at the pre-vaccine era, we saw a prevalence of HPV 16 and 18 infection of 18% among those aged 14 to 24. Again, highlighting how common of an STD this is. When we looked at in the vaccination era, what we see is this HPV 16 and 18, and this is in a national survey, the NHANES, the National Health Survey, where they collect biological samples, and it's representative of the whole United States. We see that in the vaccinated people, the prevalence of HPV 16 and 18 is 2%, down from 18, whereas in the unvaccinated people, it's about 17%. So those who are getting vaccinated, it seems to be working. There was even a little bit of evidence of herd immunity kicking in, although it's not significant. If we turn our attention, though, to other countries who have had better uptake in us, we do see evidence of herd immunity. So Australia came out with probably the strongest national HPV vaccination program at the earliest point in time. And they have been putting out so much exquisite data. I've just grabbed one to show you an example. What this data did, so they tested samples that had been banked from an STD clinic, so a high-risk setting, and they pulled samples from across years, and they indicate here where the vaccination program was implemented. And so these are the pre-vaccination period cervical results, and this is the post-vaccination. And so I'm going to pull out HPV 16 and 18 because those are our most important types. And what you see is that in this clinic of high-risk women, HPV 16 and 18 looks to be kind of coming along flat. And then as soon as this vaccination program comes in, it just starts to tank. And we're seeing then very low, exquisitely low HPV 16-18 infections about 8 years after vaccine implementation. So that shows kind of the direct benefits of HPV vaccination, but at a population level. So that was a paper that came out last year. They had a follow-on paper this year that I thought was even more interesting. Again, back to the same STD clinics, this time testing the banked samples of men. And this figure looks the same. They have year across the bottom and then the HPV prevalence on the y-axis. And they've benchmarked when the female vaccination came in, and much like the United States, where our vaccination program for males rolled out a couple years later, their male vaccination program also rolled out later. So what you see here is in the males, prior to any vaccination in country, you see a relatively stable HPV 16 and 18. It continues along, and then you see herd immunity start to kick in. And without any male vaccination on board, you see the rates of male HPV 16-18 infection coming down to almost nothing, and then really once male vaccination is on board, down to nothing. And Australia tells an interesting anecdote. I've heard them say this when they're speaking. They've gotten to the point, remember, they're using the quadrivalent vaccine, so protection against HPV 16 and 18, as well as 6 and 11, the genital wart types. When they are trying to teach their medical students what genital warts look like clinically, they don't have cases of them anymore. So they can't show people what they look like. So they're already getting to a point where they're sort of, I'm going to use the word eradicating to eradicating one of our earlier clinical presentations of HPV infections. It's brilliant. So we've now talked about Australia that came on board with an HPV vaccination program early. It had very high uptake, and now their earliest presentations of HPV diseases, which clinical warts, they're starting to eradicate. They also have publications where they're showing cervical precancer is down too. What I'm showing in this graph is a contrast between where we have in green national HPV vaccination programs versus in purple the highest incidence of cervical cancer. And what immediately jumps out is there's not much overlap, and it's devastating. A beautiful paper actually came out that was kind of the qualitative approach that quantitates actually how sad the story is, and how I think if we really kind of think about it, the global vaccination programs, we're on board in Australia, we're doing better here. The places where we're really getting, vaccination is not where we have a lot of cervical cancer. So will we see in the next, several decades global reductions in cervical cancer? Probably not. So this came out of a group in Spain, the ICO group. that showed, they did a literature search and collected data from all over the world, and they published that 75 countries, this is data as of 2015, have implemented HPV immunization programs. And what they're showing in this figure is the number of women in the world, wow, these numbers can't really say, the number of women in the world in millions against age. And what the green is the global female population. What the blue is those who are targeted by an HPV vaccination program. And what you can really just see is, you know, very visually that we're not getting it. We're not doing it. Because this age range here, as they age up, this whole band should be covered in blue, and only a very small part of it is. And again, what they showed in this paper was that basically of all the people, of all the women in the world, or girls in the world getting HPV vaccination, 1% are from low-income or low-middle-income countries. So that's the kind of global picture. We can also show it as a microcosm in the United States. This is a really simple presentation. It just shows cervical cancer mortality on the x-axis against vaccination initiation, and these are states. So you can see the fitted line where cervical cancer mortality is low, vaccination initiation is high. So again, another demonstration that, you know, we are vaccinating the people with the lowest rates of cervical cancer, unfortunately. So now I'm going to shift and talk about a little bit about some of the ongoing work that I'm doing at NCI on HPV vaccination. I had kind of touched on this when I showed you protection against oral and anal, but NCI, and I was not involved in this because I was actually here, NCI in 2004 initiated a randomized clinical trial of the bivalent HPV vaccine. As I said, this is the only publicly funded trial that was initiated prior to licensure of any of these vaccines. So it was run under an IND, an investigational new drug. NCI enrolled about 7,500 women. We didn't know if the vaccines worked, so they were, you know, enrolled to a control vaccine versus the HPV-16/18 vaccine by GSK. Women were randomized to receive 3 doses over a 6-month period and then followed actively for 4 years. What happened is that because we were studying women between the ages of 18 and 25, lots of women were getting pregnant during the vaccination phase, and so we didn't give them additional vaccines. We didn't know if it was safe. And some of the women came into our study and they had existing infections and cervical precancer and needed treatment, so we prioritized that. So what ended up happening is of these 7,500 women, about 20% of them didn't complete the dosing regimen. So it gave us this opportunity, nested within a phase 3 randomized clinical trial, to do a post-hoc analysis by number of doses received, recognizing that they weren't randomized to fewer doses, but it just so happened. And so what we see here is number of doses, 3, 2, and 1, and the number of women by control and HPV vaccine arm here. So you can see that, you know, the numbers got small. The number of women who had the endpoint that I used in this analysis, so HPV-16/18, 6-month persistent, often incident infection, and then the HPV-16/18 vaccine efficacy. And there's 2 things I want to remind you of when looking at vaccine efficacy in terms of the computation of it. One, it's highly tied to the analytical cohort, so whether it's an intention to treat analysis versus an ATP, that'll dictate the percent. I've told you that these vaccines work nearly perfectly, but that isn't an according to protocol cohort that's very clean, you know, where the women are naive. So this is sort of kind of in between, and the endpoint also matters. You know, the more robust the endpoint, the cleaner the estimates get. So because I was trying to preserve power, I didn't use the cleanest cohort, and I didn't use the strongest endpoint. And so what I would like us to do is not look at the actual estimates of efficacy, but to benchmark them against 3 doses, because we know that 3 doses in an ATP with a strong endpoint looks like 100%. So what we observed is when we compared women who got 2 doses and 1 dose to the women who had 3 doses, there were no difference in the vaccine efficacy estimates after 4 years. So this was this first inkling that maybe 3 doses was overkill almost. Maybe we didn't need to be giving 3 doses. And when we wrote this paper in 2011, we really focused on 2 doses. We said, look, the 2 doses look really good. And we kind of dismissed these because we said, 1 dose isn't supposed to work for this type of vaccine. You know, it was actually unbelievable. And so we didn't really focus on it. And we said, oh, small numbers, small endpoints. So we focused on 2 doses. And then we looked at our antibody data. This was done by my colleague Mabube Safayan, where among these same women, we had been collecting blood all along, and we tested their antibodies. And so this is time since vaccination against HPV-16 antibody titers on a log scale. And when we benchmarked this among those who are naturally infected, what we were really surprised to see is that these 1-dose antibody titers were stable out to 4 years. So are they lower than that of 2 and 3 doses? Yes, they are. But in the previous slide I showed you, those antibody titers are protecting just as well as 2 and 3 doses. And what I didn't tell you is that we don't actually know how low this line can go and still offer protection. We lack a correlate of protection. We don't know what the minimum antibody titer is that will protect women. So all we can say is where this is coming in seems to be working. So we reached out to GSK. We used the bivalent vaccine in our study. We reached out to GSK and we said, hey, can we rerun this type of analysis in your study as well? And it really independently confirmed this observation of single-dose efficacy. In parallel, there was a study by IARC going on in India that was intended to look at 2 versus 3 doses. That study was stopped due to really political suspension having nothing to do with this vaccine, and that yielded 5,000 1-dose vaccinees on their study as well. They then published a paper that showed 1 dose might be working out as well. So we have this accumulating evidence that suggests that a single dose of this vaccine would confer stable serum antibody levels and protection about HPV. So when we think about all these figures I showed you, that HPV vaccination is not getting up there, the uptake is not there, it's not reaching the poorest countries. Well, first of all, these are very costly vaccines, and the infrastructure needed to implement multi-dose regimens is really challenging. So to us, to NCI, we think this is one of these ideas that could really revolutionize kind of public health. And not only that, if we can document that this type of vaccine, this VLP, actually works in a 1-dose regimen, it kind of provides a springboard for other infectious agents. And so if we can really kind of reformulate vaccination down to a single dose, we think that would be a very big public health breakthrough. So with that, we're actually moving towards implementation of a formal randomized trial that will evaluate 1 dose of the HPV vaccines. Why are the accumulating data not enough? Just as a reminder, those were post-hoc analyses within randomized trials. You know, regulatory bodies, World Health Organization, SAGE, ACIP, you know, they don't really use that level of evidence to make policy recommendations to change. It really requires formal randomized trials. So we're moving forward with this, and our primary objectives are, wait a minute, I lost a slide, sorry. I told you there are 2 vaccines. We generated all of our 1-dose data with the bivalent vaccine, and the interesting thing with the bivalent vaccine is it's adjuvanted with kind of an adjuvant. It's not just a simple adjuvant. It's a TLR agonist, and it kind of gives a really strong antibody boost. It's the special sauce, as I understand it. And then there's also the Merck vaccines, which does use the simple adjuvant. And so one of our big questions is we don't know if the reason 1 dose seems to be working is this special adjuvant used by one vaccine, or just that the virus-like particle of all the HPV vaccines are just so specifically immunogenic that 1 dose will work with any kind. And so for that reason, we're really intending to use we're planning to look at both vaccines. So our primary objective for this trial is for each vaccine separately to assess the non-inferiority of 1 dose to 2 doses, 2 doses being the gold standard, in the prevention of cervical HPV infections. And then we're also evaluating 1 dose compared to a 0-dose group. We're going to continue to look at antibody titers. And this trial will be focused on females only, 5,000 girls per arm. And this will again be in Costa Rica. I don't know if I mentioned our previous trial was in Costa Rica. We have infrastructure set up to continue to go and implement a new trial. And so it'll be a 4-arm trial looking at 1 and 2 doses of the GSK bivalent vaccine and the Merck 9-valent vaccine among ages 12 to 16 years. And because we're ethically bound to do a non-inferiority trial at this point, we can't randomize to a 0-dose group, so we're doing a 2 versus 1. But we'd also like to collect some data from the unvaccinated girls so that we can say what happens in 0-dose, because we think most countries that will use this data will probably be going from 0 doses to 1 and not dropping down from 2 to 1. So we think it's important to benchmark against the 0 doses. So I see that, so I was going to talk about another part of my research portfolio, which is screening for oropharynx cancer, but I think we might be a little low on time. Keep going? Yeah. Okay. So that was my part on primary prevention. And again, when I think about primary prevention of HPV-driven cancers, I'm really focused on cervix. I showed you that there's more than 500,000 cervical cancers a year, and they're happening in low and middle income countries. So when I'm thinking vaccination, I'm thinking how can we get any vaccine, even 1 dose, to these countries where they need it. When I'm thinking more locally, I start to think about oropharynx cancer because I showed you that the rates of cervical to non-cervical cancers in this country is about even, and the projections are really taking off for the oropharynx. And it's just because cervical cancer screening works in this country. Is it efficient? No, but it is effective. So I started thinking about secondary prevention of HPV-driven oropharynx cancers. And so I started wondering, well, does this disease even warrant screening? Because traditionally it's been considered a rare cancer. And just to highlight, the oropharynx is the back part after the oral cavity. Most people think of it as tonsils, base of tongue. So does the disease warrant screening? Screening for rare cancers is really hard unless you have a kind of a high-risk enriched group. Do we have a biomarker that we could use? What do we do when someone screens positive? And how do we know if preventing these kind of late-stage diseases by finding a precancer or a stage 1 cancer would reduce mortality? And I think, screening for cancer is something NCI puts a lot of energy in because I think so many of our cancer screening programs have been unsuccessful. And I think, this balance between risk and good, for prostate cancer, as an example, we're not able to document that. Some of the wins are clear. Cervical cancer screening is, that works. Colon cancer screening. But so I think when we start talking about secondary prevention, we need to be very careful. So the first thing is, well, will the HPV vaccines prevent oropharynx cancer? So we should just wait it out, wait till the HPV vaccines work. I'm willing to accept that systemic vaccination will result in reductions of oral HPV prevalence among adolescents. However, I did show you that graph that shows there's new acquisitions later in life. I don't know if those cause cancer. I just think that's unknown as of now. But if the acquisition later in life does result in cancer, we will need the durability of the vaccine protection to be quite long. And what's happening with the rates of cancer? So a brilliant tenure tracker in my group, Meredith Shields, did some projections for me where she used the SEER databases, looked at year, took observed incidence rates, which are the bumpy ones, on a log scale, and then took in the last piece that had observed data, the incidence rate, the annual percent change, and projected it out on a flat line. So, and she did this by birth cohort. So when we think about screening programs, we usually think about an incidence of about 50 per 100,000 to even consider it. And right now, historically, oropharynx cancer in this country, we've been seeing incidence rates of like 10 or 15, maybe even getting to 20. But because this is one of the fastest increase in cancers in our country right now, you can see that indeed over the next several decades, and even over the next 5 years, we are going to be approaching rates that we should be thinking about secondary prevention. And the reason I had Meredith take it out to 2040 is we have to remember we're vaccinating 11 and 12-year-olds right now, and the median age of this cancer is 55. That means we need to wait 4 decades for the people who are going to be getting these cancers to be the vaccinated cohorts who will hopefully not get these cancers. So I think in those intervening 40 years, this deserves a bit of attention. Also, with HPV-driven oropharynx cancer, the median age of diagnosis is young, and the survival is high. And these people live with a slew of complications, and their quality of life is very poor. So again, if we could kind of stage shift them down towards a precancer or an early stage cancer, maybe we could improve their quality of life significantly. So do we have a biomarker? How are we going to screen for this cancer? So working with my colleagues at the German Cancer Research Center, we discovered that the HPV-16 E6 antibody, so E6 is one of the 2 oncoproteins on the HPV genome, predicts risk of oropharynx cancer more than a decade before the cancer is diagnosed. So we found this in a European cohort, and we got pretty excited about it, but we said, wait, this needs confirmation. And I'm going to share with you the confirmation data because it's not published, and it's always more fun to look at unpublished data. So we did this confirmation in the NCI prostate, lung, colon, ovary screening trial, or PLCO. This was a study that was initiated in 1992. Everyone came in, 150,000 people, baseline blood draw. And then it had a unique design feature because it didn't just do an enrollment blood draw, which most cohort studies do, it did serial blood draws for 6 years. The reason I get excited about that design feature is that I can then do kinetics studies. We can look at the antibody patterns over time to E6, to the oncoprotein. And it should be noted that the time between the blood draw and the cancer diagnosis was 6.6 years. So we did a nested case control study. We did, oropharynx cancer cases, matched controls, and looked at the antibody marker positivity. So what did we see? This is HPV-16E6. So in the controls, the proportion that were seronegative was 99.5%. So that would obviously be the specificity of the marker. We're seeing a very high specificity. And when we looked at the oropharynx cases, what we saw was that the marker was present prior to diagnosis in about half. And I didn't highlight this in the slide where I showed you the geographic heterogeneity, but about a decade ago, when we looked at HPV causing oropharynx cancer, it was actually about half. So that suggested to us that the sensitivity of the marker for an HPV-driven oropharynx cancer, because half of them were caused by tobacco, half by HPV, although that is certainly changing, the sensitivity of the marker could be quite high. So from there, that was just off the enrollment baseline serum. We then took the oropharynx cancers and we looked at their antibody titers to E6 in these 6 serial blood draws that they had. So on the x-axis, I'm showing you years from when the blood was drawn. So the study started in 92, 93. They took blood draws. They took serial blood draws up until, and then here's time of diagnosis. And PLCO keeps doing record linkages to see who gets cancer, who gets cancer, who gets cancer. So the E6 seropositive are in the black filled in lines, and then the E6 seronegative are in the open ones. And so to me, these data are remarkable because what you're seeing is, and this is the threshold for positivity, you're seeing a biomarker that when it's positive, it is very strongly positive, it is consistently positive, and when it's negative, it's negative. So sensitivity suggests to me here that it will be very high. I showed you specificity was very high. I highlighted these 2 because these are the only 2 where I see a seroconversion happening. And this is happening, more than a decade before the cancer. So to me, this is actually exactly what we would want in a biomarker. When we think about a cancer biomarker, we want it to be incredibly sensitive and incredibly specific to achieve risk stratification. So we took these results, and because this work was a nested case control study in a cohort study, we were able to weight back the observed lab results to the entire population and then do cumulative risk stratification modeled over time. So what we see here is time and entry among different categories of HPV-16 E6 seropositivity. And I want to call your attention to the seropositive males in purple, which shows that over a decade, the percent chance of getting an HPV-driven oropharynx cancer was 6%. So that's not high enough, because usually when we benchmark, what does the risk need to be for a biomarker, it's usually around 1% per year, and so this is, of course, 0.6% per year. But there's a bunch of caveats on this, so I don't know that we can really just, dismiss it. So this is really my other area of research. And then finally, if we were going to go out and do a big study where we test people for HPV-16 E6 antibodies, well, then what would we do if they screen positive? And so some of the other ideas that I'm considering right now in terms of research are describing a precancerous lesion, because we don't have that well described for the oropharynx. How do we diagnose these cancers? And what are some non-invasive treatment alternatives to just an open surgery or radiation? And I think these include robotics, maybe tonsillectomy, and I continue to be optimistic about some of the therapeutic HPV vaccines, and actually think that this would be a unique setting to test those vaccines. And then finally, I think, again, we have to be very cautious in implementing and recommending secondary prevention. So I think we'd want to know that either stage shifting or, finding the precancer and treating it reduces disease-specific mortality. So for this part of my research, I do anticipate an increased burden of HPV-driven oropharynx cancer over the coming decades. And in fact, I work quite a bit with the otolaryngology clinic here. I did my doctoral dissertation in that clinic, and I'm quite happy to still be a part of it and doing work with them. I do think the prophylactic HPV vaccine will work, but not for decades. We've identified a promising biomarker, and so I'm kind of standing at this point now where I know future work is needed to determine if this is a viable option for prevention. So I collaborate with a lot of people. These are my collaborations on my vaccine work, and these are my collaborations on my head and neck work. Thank you. Thank you.
So do we have questions from the audience?
I'm wondering, for your E6 detection work, have you looked at whether it's equally predictive of integrated HPV cases and non-integrated?
We have not looked at that. The story with integration with head and neck with the oropharynx is a little bit different, and we think there's pretty good data to show that it doesn't need to integrate to really cause, so we haven't done that.
That's easy. Great talk, Amy. I'm curious, just completely out of curiosity, there were something like 5 E6 positive controls in PLCO. Mm-hmm. What do the IRBs at this point say about that?
So just as an anecdote, in the European cohort study, which was when we kind of did our discovery work, one of our we had a very handful of controls, and one of them developed anal cancer, which, as we know, that's caused by HPV infection as well. And so what we then did was we kind of repeated the whole nested case control study and looked at anal, vaginal, vulvar, penile, cervical. And I should have mentioned, Amy, cervical cancer, the cervix is an immunopermissive site, so antibody, they don't see HPV infections kind of systemically. So the antibody response based on cervical cancer is really poor. It's about 50% sensitive at the time of diagnosis. So when we have controls, what we've seen is that maybe they're having a cancer at another anatomic site, or that they're cooking. But the IRBs will not allow for recontact. It's a research assay. The PPV is I showed you it was less than 1% per year. So I would like to even just do research with recontact, and it's nearly impossible.
Wow.
So
Interesting.
good question. Dr. Nelson, did you have a question?
Yeah, a couple.
Yeah.
Does Gavi support the HPV vaccine?
Sure.
Because that's really a critical feature in getting to
Absolutely.
They do?
Yeah, so it's included in their revolving fund. So
That means that UNICEF or other organizations could purchase, because this is an expensive vaccine.
Yeah, so the vaccine in this country, I don't know the market price as of right now. I think it's about $130 per dose times 2 or 3, obviously.
Right, that's way over what.
Way over. And so the Gavi prices, I think, are about $6 or $8 right now. I don't know if you know more specifically. And so what they'll do, what Gavi is doing for countries is they'll bring vaccine in, they'll build infrastructure there with the idea of graduating them. So you have Gavi graduates that then come out. A lot of these heavily supported demonstration projects have shown very good uptake. I haven't seen well-documented sustainability, unfortunately.
Yeah, another comment. I think that there's a group in Asia that's doing screening for EBV-related nasopharyngeal cancers, which are even more difficult to document and screen for. So there is a model.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, I was very excited about your 1 dose versus 2 to 3. We've been working with the Chinese that has another viral particle vaccine for hepatitis E. And it's also very immunogenic, even more than natural infection. But the studies have been done on a 3-dose schedule over 6 months. And if you wanted to really, and the issue here is that pregnant women who get infected during late pregnancy particularly are at very high risk to morbidity and mortality from hepatitis E. So if you wanted to use this vaccine, 3 doses is out of the question, and even prophylactically. So I'm very excited because I think 1 dose is, with a good adjuvant, is good for these vaccines, and that's the way to go. It's not to, if you can get 1 dose in a lot of people, it'll probably work.
Yeah, thank you.
So I
agree.
I have a follow-up question because I was excited to hear about the RCT that you're doing in Costa Rica, the
Thank
2 versus
you.
one dose. I was actually wondering about the kind of ethical questions about offering 1 dose versus 2 dose. I mean, do you already know that it at least gives some protection, that 1 dose will at least give some protection, and then if you find that it doesn't, are there plans to actually offer healthcare services to people who might later actually have HPV because the dosing wasn't sufficient?
Yes.
I'm just curious how you work around that.
All good questions. So at this point, we feel that we're in clinical equipoise. We have documented evidence from 3 different studies. And by the way, we're continuing to monitor the previous trial to document long-term protection. So we think the level of a priori evidence going in is quite high. And that's what a randomized trial is. You don't know if it's going to work. You think it's going to, so you do it. But of course, if we have epic failure in one of our 1-dose arms, then we will offer follow-up vaccination. So they would then get 2 doses. We wouldn't do any clinical testing because in that age range, everyone gets HPV and most people clear it. So in fact, it's unethical to kind of screen adolescent, because you would take action on something that has a high probability of clearing. Yeah.
So I have a similar question to that, but actually the other way around, where assuming if the 1 dose versus 2 dose trial shows, non-inferiority, that means 1 dose is good. What are actually the next steps for this kind of trial? Like what other trials would you be planning, and how soon would you think it would be feasible for a 1-dose vaccine to be approved for this age group?
I like all your questions. So the goal of our study is to generate 4-year data, and we have a 2-year enrollment period, so that'll be 4-year data that'll take us 6 years to get, that we would then take to World Health Organization, because that's really our audience. Getting we're not a sponsor, we're not the pharmaceutical company, so we're not taking this for label change to FDA in the US because they won't even like our non-inferiority margin. So this is not for a US audience. If the CDC ACIP wants to kind of pay attention and talk about recommendations around it, but we're not looking for label change here. Our audience is global, and it's really to provide the data to recommending bodies, to PAHO, to World Health, to SAGE, to the TEAG, for then countries to really make individual level choices. Because what I also think is even if one dose is inferior by our standards, what if we say 2 doses is 95% efficacious and 1 dose rolls in at 80%? Giving 80% to a large proportion of giving 1 dose with 80% efficacy, herd immunity will pick that up. I mean, we're doing modeling work on it right now, but you can easily overcome a deficiency in efficacy by vaccinating more people, so the idea is really to generate high quality data that can then be used by, individual countries to make policy change.
I would like to know about the therapeutic use of the vaccine. How much do we know right now, and is it any correlation with the dose of the vaccine itself?
You're right. So these are fully prophylactic vaccines. The way these vaccines work, the ones that we're talking about here, are that they prevent entry of the virus, into the cell so that it blocks cell entry. And so there is very well documented at this point, in my opinion, no therapeutic efficacy for this vaccine type. Having said that, there are therapeutic HPV vaccines, which I think Richard could speak about more eloquently than I. There was a big publication in Lancet by Connie Trimble last year, from Hopkins, showing some kind of proof of concept that these therapeutic vaccines could work, but the efficacy is not nearly as high. I mean, I think it's, about 40% efficacious. But that's why I get excited about therapeutic vaccines with either an anal cancer or an oropharynx cancer, because the cervix, if you find it at a precancer, you can do an excision of the tissue and you're pretty good to go. That is highly curative. With the oropharynx, you can't, or the anus, you can't excise that and still have function. So to me, the therapeutic vaccines actually get more exciting for the other anatomic sites. Personal opinion.
I'm going to take the last question then.
Please.
Aimee, so what do you think the future of cervical screening is now that we have HPV vaccines? What you have a cost benefit, and also the efficacy of the screening, the predictive value is going to drop.
Right, absolutely. So, of course, you all know that, with lower prevalence, the predictive capabilities diminish. I get really excited about, so there's a lot of talk in our research community right now about pairing these things up and even, really dropping down to 1 or 2 screenings in a lifetime that are type specific. I think it'll depend on where you are. I think if you're US based and you stay with the more is more idea, then you'll keep screening and you'll probably do it more than you should. And maybe in some of these more, I'm going to use the word reasonable countries that kind of aren't as invasive, maybe it's a once in a lifetime screen,
Make a liar of me. One more question.
I heard that the movement on screening was screening for HPV, screening for the virus.
Oh, absolutely.
Not screening necessarily for lesions.
No.
Particularly if a person's been vaccinated, you could, or even if they haven't, you could screen for the virus.
Absolutely.
And
That's
that
already,
might be more effective.
Yeah, in this country and in many countries around the world, this country does co-testing, so HPV plus cytology. HPV can only start to be used at about age 30 and up because, like we said, lots of people get it and they clear it, and you need to give time to clear it. So applying HPV testing in younger people is not appropriate, but once they age into their 30s, if you're fighting HPV. So yeah, lots of people, in this country, co-testing is recommended. Primary HPV screening is recommended in many countries around the world as well. So you're
And the patient could take their own sample.
absolute I think our field is brilliant. We have, self-collection is now showing to really, self-collection, HPV-based diagnostics, cytology requires too much standardization and is not sustainable in poor countries.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aimee. It was a beautiful talk.